Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Green Fund's CannaCast. My name is Louis, and I'm very excited to bring you today's guest, Jason Silva. Jason is a television personality. He's known for hosting National Geographic shows such as Origins and Brain Games, and he's also known for his viral YouTube videos called Shots of Awe. Jason has been described as the Timothy Leary of the viral age, and when you listen to this interview, it becomes pretty clear how he got that title. Through his ability to speak in fully formed paragraphs in which Jason weaves together citations from philosophers, authors, and intellectuals, Jason has used this gift of the gab to carve a unique niche for himself. Jason is extremely good at what he does, and I had a pleasure chatting with him about cannabis, psychedelics, and flow states. I hope you enjoy this episode of the CannaCast with none other than Jason Silva. Jason, welcome, and thank you for doing this with me. To begin, you're described as a futurist. What is a futurist, and do you still call yourself one?
Well, the term futurist is not one that I christened myself with, but I did become well known for a lot of digital content that I created on the internet that was exploring technological disruption, exponential technologies, and the future of humanity. And I think whenever you are sort of espousing a vision of the ways in which the world is being transformed by technology, you get labeled a futurist, which is great. You know, I am interested in the future to the degree that I'm interested in human development and human transformation and how we might steer the direction of this transformation. And that's, you know, within the space or the context of information technologies. But I also have an interest in consciousness and I have an interest in psychedelics and cannabis. And it actually is not that much of a stretch to have an interest in these things, because I believe that cannabis, like other psychoactive compounds, are also information technologies in that they sort of can be deployed to rewire how we think, to expand the repository of our thinking, to increase pattern recognition, to increase performance. So to the degree that these are ecstatic technologies that we can use, I also have an interest in them. So you could say that my interest lies at the intersection of information technologies and psychoactive technologies. And I'm not the first person to go down this path. People like Timothy Leary in the 1960s embraced what they called cyberdelics, which is where cybernetics and psychedelics overlap. There's a great book by John Markoff called What the Dormouse Said, which looks at how Silicon Valley in the 1960s was the perfect melting pot of technology and psychoactive compounds, and how the overlap between those two things transformed the ways in which we thought about how to use technologies to change the world. So I'm sort of following in the footsteps of that line of thinking to a degree.
Yeah, that reminds me of something Terence McKenna said, which is that humans were the conduits of technology, and that in some respects, just as fruit relies on being eaten and having its seeds spread, technology requires humans to create it. And we're like a cocoon, and technology will be the butterfly that emerges from us. What are your thoughts on that theory?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's open to interpretation. This is the same thing that Kevin Kelly's the name he gives it is the technium, and in seeing technology as literally the seventh kingdom of life, we let go of this false duality between nature and tech. Nature and tech are not different things. Just like nature and humans are not different things. We sprouted from nature the same way flowers, sprout from the earth. So we are nature, and technology is an extension of us and our nature. And it has sort of the same evolutionary and biological drives, according to Kevin Kelly. I believe his sentence was, "We are the sex organs of technology." which I think echoes what McKenna was saying as well. And it makes a lot of sense, and in terms of the fear of like, AI taking over. I think that's just like a sort of science fiction dystopian scenario, which again makes a distinction between the AI and us. And it's like, oh, AI is this like evil force and it's going to enslave us, and it's not necessarily. AI is an extension of us. AI is human imagination, human. I don't see us to say that it's saying that we enslave each other from the time, but there's also this trajectory of increased freedom. So I still think that like we're better off now than we used to be.
Okay, and to pivot slightly off of the topic of AI, obviously cannabis legalization is occurring at the fastest rate in history. What do you think of this, and what is your personal relationship like with cannabis?
This is fairly simple. I see cannabis as a psychoactive technology that I use to engender novelty in my thinking. Michael Pollan, who wrote How to Change Your Mind and Botany of Desire, once described cannabis as a meme mutagen. So it allows the generation of new ideas, of new memes. It's like lubricating the engine. And to that degree, I see it as a performance enhancing technology. So for me, it energizes my thinking, it catalyzes my creativity, it expands and increases my pattern recognition. And it's a wonderful tool for dropping the thread of time and getting into the present moment.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on the point of cannabis being potentially a performance enhancing drug. I mean, it seems every week now a new athlete comes out in support of cannabis use, or they say that CBD oil helped them recover quicker. So what impact do you think this will have then, this ability for cannabis to be a performance enhancing drug or to bring you into the present moment? How will this impact society at large?
Well, cannabis, like other psychoactive compounds, are extraordinarily sensitive to what Rich Doyle calls initial rhetorical conditions, which essentially means context or set and setting. And so to a large degree, your cannabis experience is programmed or predetermined by the context in which you partake in cannabis. So in a way, it's you might see it as a placebo with booster rockets, to use the phrase that Michael Pollan put out. So if so first and foremost, of course, I think that once the stigma around illegality, the anxiety around getting arrested, the fear that people have of cannabis goes away, I think that it also gets rid of the negative experiences associated with cannabis. You're less likely to get paranoid when getting high if there's not a larger cultural context that's encouraging you to get paranoid, right? But by the same token, if you're just getting high in front of the couch eating Cheetos, I believe your experience of eating Cheetos is going to be enhanced, but not much else is going to happen necessarily. However, if you have an understanding of this tool as a technology that increases suggestibility to stimuli and receptivity to stimuli, then what you really want to do is you want to curate and titrate the environments and contexts in which you take cannabis so that you can radically enhance the effects of those contexts and those environments. So my primary interest in cannabis is I use cannabis to enhance the power of aesthetic experiences for their therapeutic value. So I believe beauty heals. I believe that art heals. I believe that cinema can heal. So when I partake in cannabis, I want to go to beautiful places to facilitate the capacity of the beautiful place to impact my consciousness. When I have cannabis and watch an art film, I'm using the cannabis to enhance the capacity of that art film to have its way with me. So essentially, I'm curating environments and then I'm partaking in cannabis so that I can set up that environment to do its best work on me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And this belief or act of using cannabis to induce or curate experiences of awe ties into something that I've been wondering recently, which is there are frequent reports of people using cannabis and psychedelics more broadly often experience feelings of religiosity or spirituality. And, there's even been evidence recently of cannabis discovered at an ancient religious site in Israel, which suggests that maybe religions were deeply intertwined with these substances, and perhaps a lot of religious experience was the result of these substances. Do you think, in legalizing cannabis and eventually psychedelics, we'll begin to reintroduce this notion of awe and spirituality into society?
Yeah, that's a great question. The subject of awe is a massive interest of mine. Experiences of awe are described as experiences of perceptual expansion or perceptual vastness of such intensity that our mental models of the world are forced into a state of accommodation. And this is important because our mental models of the world determine our experience of the world. We grow up and we create these maps of reality, and then we live inside those maps. And that's fine until those maps become deadened by habit. You're living inside of these familiar maps, and then you're not having that sense of childhood discovery and curiosity of discovering new things. Like most people create these maps and live inside these maps. Like most people in America barely leave 100 miles of where they were born. Like people just kind of stay in their routines. But it's only when we go beyond our routines that we have the possibility of encountering the vastness that overwhelms, you might describe it. The oceanic consciousness associated with seeing the ocean, or traveling to an exotic location, or learning a different language. And it turns out that anytime we get to the territory beyond the maps, we are more likely to experience awe. And awe leaves all this, aside from being exhilarating in the moment, it leaves this wonderful afterglow that includes increased well-being, increased compassion, and increased creativity. So awe is good for the soul. Awe is good for the mind. Awe is good for mental health. So that's a fact. Positive psychologists have already proved this. So if you now have access to cannabis as a tool to heighten your sensitivity and your suggestibility to those spaces and places that might evoke awe, you might think of cannabis as like fairy dust. It's like allows you to sprinkle fairy dust to re-enchant your experience of the world. And anytime you have an experience of enchantment, that has the beginnings of religiosity or spirituality, right? And so that's great. But what I think is important is that spirituality be kept private. I believe in a separation between church and state. And I believe in a separation between the poetic and the empirical. I believe that religion becomes corrupted once you turn a religious experience, which is a very personal thing, into scripture that other people have to follow. So in other words, I would never say to people, this is what you have to believe when you smoke cannabis, or this is what the experience has to tell you about your life. No, that's for you to decide. The only thing that I would prescribe are the preconditions for a positive experience. I would recommend go to nature, listen to music you love, hang out with someone interesting, and then have some cannabis. But whatever occurs inside of that experience, that's for you. It shouldn't be something you impose upon other people. It's like Ursula Le Guin. She said, science describes accurately from the outside. Poetry describes accurately from the inside. Science explicates, poetry implicates. So keep those two realms separate. Use cannabis to cultivate spiritual experiences for yourself. But spirituality is like art. It's about interpretation. It's personal. It should never be deemed objective or empirical.
Okay, and on that topic, psychedelics are often done with shamans. So in the Amazon, for example, when people take ayahuasca, they do so within a ritual setting as guided by a shaman. Do you think when psychedelics get reintegrated into society, we'll see more of these shamans or a new form of shamanism? Do you think there'll be kind of guides and teachers in the psychedelic space when it becomes legal?
I definitely think that we'll see that. We're already seeing psychedelic clinics around the world. I think it'll be very, very important to have some kind of a way to make sure that whoever is administering the substances doesn't bring their own baggage or projections into the experience of the passenger or the guests of these psychedelic clinics. I'm averse to the term shaman or priestlyhood because I think shamans and priests are too easily able to act in a corrupt fashion. We give them too much power. My view is that the real shaman is the artist. The real shaman doesn't call himself a shaman. The ecstatic technicians of the sacred are the philosophers and the artists. Vincent van Gogh and his impressionist paintings, that's shamanism. Musicians that make incredible music, they're shamans. But the guy that wears, a $200 medicine hat that he bought in Tulum and calls himself a shaman, sometimes is just a guy that wants to seduce women that he's administered psychoactive compounds to. So you have to be really, really careful when giving people the power to be your shaman. At the same time, what I would like to see in psychedelic clinics are classically trained therapists who have also worked very strongly with psychedelics, people who can hold the space without introducing any of their own thing. Unless you want to bring an artist to curate a psychedelic experience, but then you should label it as such. You shouldn't say this is a shaman. You should say this is an artist and he's going to DJ an experience for you. And if you like it, great, but don't call him your shaman.
And Jason, when speaking on cannabis, and I assume this also applies to psychedelics, you've previously said that cannabis can expand lateral thinking. It can enable you to link together seemingly disjointed ideas. Now, if psychedelics and cannabis become legal in society, do you think we're going to begin seeing more visionary people, the Elon Musks of the world, the Steve Jobses of the world? Do you think this will increase as psychedelics and cannabis become more legal?
Yes. The lateral thinking idea with cannabis, I first discovered a few years ago when I read a study that was looking at semantic priming. So semantic priming has to do with associations, sort of how your mind makes associations between concepts. And so if I say the word bird, you might associate that with wings and with flight. Those are obvious linkages, conceptual linkages and associations. Now, it turns out that cannabis can induce what's called hyperpriming. Hyperpriming means you're expanding your associative network. So this time, when I say bird, instead of just writing wings and flight, you might make more imaginative conceptual leaps of association. So you might say, actually, bird makes me think of flying over all my limitations. And flying over my limitations makes me think about the ways in which humans transcend their limits. So you might make more like elastic, more imaginative leaps. So it facilitates what I might call poetic languaging. And that's a good thing. And that's definitely something cannabis can do. That's why cannabis is associated with improvisation and improvisational arts, like jazz, like spoken word, like rap, freestyle rap. However, the only caveat is that too much hyperpriming can then cross the threshold into incoherence or like speaking in tongues, where now you're just making associations that don't make any sense and you sound like a crazy person. So there has to be a balance between disinhibiting yourself enough to stretch your conceptual linkages, but also immediately inhibiting yourself afterwards to make sure the conceptual linkages actually fit and actually work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you kind of have to have one foot in reality, you would say.
Well, you have to be surfing. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah, well, to tie this into what I was speaking about before, it kind of reminds me of Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory, which is that the ability for cannabis and psychedelics to improve our linguistic capacities and allow for things like improvisation may have even led to our evolution from apes to humans. Do you subscribe to McKenna's stoned ape theory? And if so, why? If not, why not?
I think it's very, very compelling and persuasive. It's hard to prove, right? But as a proof of concept, it definitely makes sense. And given that we really don't have a theory to account for that sort of transcendence from sort of animal consciousness to self-reflective consciousness, it does seem like one of the unintended consequences of eating the mushrooms that were growing in the I guess in the droppings of animals might have increased visual acuity and led to neurogenesis, and then maybe even synesthesia, which is the beginning of language, right? Like seeing sounds is a synesthetic thing. When you see something and then you find a word to describe what you're seeing, that's an act of synesthesia. So languaging is synesthetic. And we know one of the effects of psychedelics is synesthesia. So it's compelling.
Yeah, personally, I think the existing alternative theories are that having cooked meat as well as becoming bipedal, which allowed for our brains to grow larger, these are what led to human evolution. But these theories, to me, in some respects, seem piecemeal when you compare them to some of the accounts that people have of psychedelic experiences, particularly the ones that are comparable to near-death experiences.
It could be that it's both, right? I mean, we do know that before we started cooking food, we spent most of our time chewing. So, waking life was sedentary and effortful, just chewing all the time. Once we cooked meat, the amount of nutrition we got from every meal was enough to keep us full for longer, which means that we had the time to like take mushrooms and think because we didn't have to be like chewing all the time. So, you could see it as like the perfect combination of all those elements.
Yeah, that's true. And I think having time to think is a rarity in the animal world in a lot of respects. So that definitely put us in a unique category, and look where we are as a result. But to pivot to one of our final questions and head in the complete opposite direction, as I mentioned at the start of the interview, Jason, you're a futurist. So what is it that excites you about the future?
Well, one of the things that excites me about the future is the idea of designer subjectivities. So my friend Jamie Wheel and Stephen Kotler, they wrote the book Stealing Fire about the future of modulating and mediating consciousness and sort of hacking flow states. And they introduced this concept of the four forces of ecstasy: psychology, technology, neurobiology, and pharmacology. And we're having parallel advances in those four areas, right? So if we're having all these advances in psychology, all these advances in technology, all these advances in neurobiology, and all these advances in pharmacology, our capacity to modulate and mediate and to a certain degree stage design lived experience is increasing. And what's exciting about that is that basically we can then engender mental experiences for ourselves that are, the sky's the limit. Imagine all the music in the world, imagine all the art in the world, all the ways in which we can already hack our experience simply by exposing ourselves to art, music, places, spaces, ideas, that we're going to have an even better toolkit to be even more capable of just crafting experiences of heightened qualitative intensity for ourselves. So I just like the idea of blowing our own minds in ways we can hardly even imagine.
Yeah, it's true. And as our understanding of ourselves grows, we're almost like breaking through the fourth wall and learning how to shape human experiences ourselves. And this notion, this concept of hacking, to use your phrase, the human experience, to me, is language like you would use on a computer, which sounds like the simulation theory. And I'm sure, Jason, that you've heard of this theory before, but it is that we're living in a highly sophisticated video game, and that as we continue to develop an understanding of the parameters of the game we're within, we can effectively learn to push certain buttons to elicit specific responses. What do you think of the simulation theory?
I don't know if I buy the simulation hypothesis that we're actually in a video game, but yes, in the sense, like, we don't have a direct experience of the world. Our brain is locked inside our skull, and our eyes are not windows. Our eyes are lenses that are turning light into electrical signals. And so what we call the world is a sort of digitized reconstruction by the brain. And so to that end, the analogy of the video game works. And yeah, like we're learning all the buttons to press to improve our experience of the video game. So why not?
Yeah, very, very good points. And final question, Jason, what is on the horizon for Jason Silva? Where can people find you and what will you be doing?
Well, people can always find me on the interwebs. I'm at Jason L. Silva on Instagram, Jason L. Silva on Facebook. And I am continuously trying to push the envelope of these conversations and reflections in my digital content. They can also listen to my podcast, Flow Sessions, where I sit down with a lot of thinkers. It's available on Spotify and iTunes. And then we'll see, coming out of COVID, I hope to get back on the road doing speaking engagements in the next couple of months.
All right. That wraps up yet another episode of the Green Fund's CannaCast. I hope you all enjoyed that episode. And if you did, make sure to check out more of Jason's work across all of his social media channels at Jason L. Silva. As you could probably tell from that interview, Jason is not only an amazing speaker with amazing skills of articulation, but he also has a contagious positivity and exuberance about him. And this seems to be increasingly rare in today's day and age. So, if you ever feel like you could use more awe and more wonder in your life, definitely give Jason's videos a watch. But that's it from me. We have more exciting guests lined up in the coming weeks, so make sure to check us out on our YouTube channel, our Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts. Until next time.